We are now recording. Barry.
Thank you very much, Phil. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the people that have joined the meeting. My name is Barry White. I'm from Action on Climate Emergency Settling Area. That's ACE for short. And I represent ACE at meetings of Fossil Free North Yorkshire, who have called this meeting this evening. The title of this meeting is The Great Pensions Scandal, and people certainly of my generation would of course link such a title with the late Robert Maxwell, publisher, former MP, football club owner and newspaper owner. And as some of you will recall, he plundered his companies of pension funds to shore up the shares of the Mirror Group and save his companies from bankruptcy. It was a great scandal at the time, resulting in pensioners receiving only about half of their company pension entitlement. But today we are witnessing another and far greater pension scandal. The fact that millions, if not billions of pounds are still being invested in pension funds in fossil fuel companies. The warnings are clear that they continue to increase production of oil and gas, which release emissions that have a devastating impact on our planet. The science is clear. We're in a climate emergency that fossil fuels are helping to create. Just recall the recent UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC report published in August. Against this background, I'd like to introduce our two speakers. Dr. Margaret Jackson, a GP from our region and coordinator of Fossil Free North Yorkshire, and Councillor Christian Vesey, a Lib Dem councillor from the City of York Council, who is also chair of the council's Climate Change Policy and Scrutiny Committee, and who sits on North Yorkshire County Council Pension Fund Committee. They will speak for 15 minutes each and will be followed by contributions in the form of questions and comments from yourselves. Before closing the meeting, probably around about 6 o'clock, both Margaret and Christian will sum up and perhaps offer actions for the future. So enough of me, over to Margaret, who will introduce herself.
Thanks, Barry, and thanks, Phil. And I was just actually saying to Phil as we were sort of preparing that I'm so impressed by the organisation for York Environment Week. It's been superb. So thanks very much for that. So I'm Margaret Jackson, GP from Slights and Sands End, which is near Whitby, and a GP educator and increasingly involved in planetary health, which is the sort of the link between the climate crisis and, if you like, health. And work quite a lot with MedAct, which is a public health charity that essentially is looking to address the causes of the reduction in people's health that can be addressed, and one of those manifest things is the climate crisis. And I'm also involved in Fossil Free North Yorkshire, which I will be talking about. So I'm going to share my screen. Actually, just before I do that, because there's such a small number, I think it would be really useful, and I can't see any of the people. I don't know if any of you want to turn your cameras on or are able to, or it's fine if you don't. But it'd be great to hear from you very briefly, sort of who you are, and maybe what's brought you to this webinar this evening. So Jonathan's just turned camera on. Do you want to say something, Jonathan?
Hello, yeah. So I'm a trustee on two charitable trusts that are very interested in climate crisis. And for example, we've supported MedAct, which you mentioned. So that's my sort of background.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan. Reinhard.
Yeah, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I think that, as I have said before, that our financial system, and I include this pension system as part of the financial system, is poorly understood by many people, or they are even actively made disinterested in what is happening. And so I think it is a major tool actually to address the climate crisis. And unfortunately, it's not so much considered. And on the other hand, I'm a former university teacher, and there is a university sort of pension fund. And it's, in my experience, it's actually quite difficult to find out where the pension fund invests and what, even if you contribute and are actively interested, how you can sort of change direction. It's a sort of uphill struggle. It's like a maze trying to find out what is happening within your own pension fund and how to make it sort of sustainable and invest in renewable energy. Sorry, I talk too much.
Thanks, Reinhard. Now then, either of our other two participants. Hi, Lucy.
Hi, I'm just a student at sixth form at the moment, and I'm really interested in, the environment, and I'm hoping to study that at university, environmental science. So I just thought it would be interesting to kind of hear, you're all in the profession of, of the environment and stuff like that. So I thought it'd be interesting to hear and learn about it a bit more.
Oh, that's brilliant. That's great. And thanks ever so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And our last participant, I'm sorry, I don't know your name. But it's fine if you just want to listen in. So, yeah, and I will just also say right at the start that this is a kind of unapologetic recruiting drive, really, for fossil-free North Yorkshire. So if any of these guys that are joining us today, if any of you are interested in actually getting involved in the campaign, then you'd be extremely welcome. So at this point, I will share my screen and rattle through a presentation. And please, can you put any comments or questions into the chat? Now, have you I don't know how well you can see my screen there. Have you got something blocking the view, or is it gone? It's all right, is it? Okay, good. So this is what we're doing today, the Great Pension Scandal. And we've talked a little bit about fossil-free North Yorkshire. And there is our email address and our Twitter handle, which I'll also give you at the end. So what I intend to talk about is why divestment is such an issue, what's happening locally, and then Christian's going to go on and talk about the huge potential that there is in green reinvestment, and then we hope to have plenty of time for questions and discussion afterwards. So I guess people are aware what divestment is. It's simply the opposite of investment. So basically means getting rid of stocks and bonds and investment funds that are unethical. And in this case, we're talking about fossil fuel companies investing in oil, coal and gas. So fossil fuel companies are the wealthiest and most powerful companies on the planet. And they are using their money, power and influence to block every serious attempt to stop climate change. And really what we're interested in fossil-free North Yorkshire is institutional divestment. So this is about convincing institutions to divest and publicly break their ties, which weakens the political influence of the fossil fuel industry. So every time an institution publicly divests, it chips away at the power, at the social license that these immoral businesses command. The agenda of the fossil fuel industry is just not compatible with the survival of our planet. So I'm going to talk to you about the carbon bubble very briefly. So the carbon, this concept was created by Carbon Tracker, and basically this red circle that you see describes the emissions, the potential emissions of the known reserves of coal, oil, and natural gas in the world. And this blue, much smaller circle shows the amount of carbon that can be, if you like, exploited before we hit planetary limits. And bearing in mind that the red circle does not tell us about the exploration that these companies are currently involved in. So this is known reserves, and these are companies that are continuing to explore for yet more reserves. So the former governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, has said that the world would be well, you can read off the screen that the carbon budget consistent with the 2-degree target would render the vast majority of reserves stranded. Hello. So divestment makes financial sense. Fossil fuel stocks are on a long-term downward trajectory, and COVID-19 has only intensified this. Renewable stock prices are growing year on year. So why would you want to continue investing in a failing industry, essentially? Not divesting risks serious cost to institutional investment funds. The value of oil company shares owned by UK public pension funds fell by 2 billion in less than 4 years. In 2015, local government pensions lost a collective 683 million by not divesting from coal in time. And there are countless examples throughout history of fossil fuel companies trampling on human rights. Divestment is one of the most direct ways that people in the UK can take action to support countries in the global south that are some of the worst affected by exploitative oil giants. For instance, Shell has been involved in several high-profile environmental scandals, paying millions of dollars of fines for its operations in Nigeria and threatening to drill in the fragile environment of the Arctic. And recently, both the UK government and the oil company Total have come under fire for plans to build a gas project in Mozambique, and probably people may have heard about this, despite significant adverse environmental and social impacts associated with this. So action is needed to dismantle the power and influence of this reckless industry and instead prioritise the health and rights of people around the world. And divestment works. So the most sort of, in a sense, the most possibly one of the best examples of that is in the case of South African apartheid, where international divestment was a very significant contributor to the ultimate dismantling of that appalling system. Globally, the divestment movement is having a significant impact on the clout of the fossil fuel industry. The number of institutional investors committed to divest rose from 180 in 2014 to more than 1,100 in 2019. People might have seen that Royal Dutch Shell listed divestment campaigns as a material risk in its 2019 annual report. And Bob Dudley, the former CEO of oil giant BP, said in 2018 that activist efforts could threaten energy security and the global economy. So this is the sort of picture we've got so far with divestment around the world. So 14.61 trillion, and I think that's dollars, has so far been divested or committed to divestment. This is institutional divestment. This doesn't include individual divestment. So 1,300 odd institutions are divesting, and then 58,000 individuals are divesting, also about $5.2 billion. And you can see on the right hand side of this slide the breakdown of the organisations that have been involved in divestment. And it did begin with churches, essentially. They spearheaded divestment. So why is it important to concentrate on local government pension funds? Well, essentially because if it's wrong to wreck the planet, then it's wrong to profit from or invest in the wreckage. 6.8 million people in the UK rely on local government pension funds to provide them with an income when they retire. The climate crisis is forcing workers, investors, policymakers, and the public to reconsider what their money is doing in their name. This is a report from Friends of the Earth and Platform London, published earlier this year, which is very carefully and thoroughly researched. And it found that local government pensions hold investments of nearly 10 billion in fossil fuels. So that's £1,450 for each of its 6.8 million members of local government pension schemes across the UK, and about 3% of the total scheme value. Over 3/4 of local councils have declared a climate emergency, including City of York Council, but not North Yorkshire County Council. The majority of councils, their largest carbon emissions will come from their pension fund investments. Many local government pension funds have already committed to divest from fossil fuels, including South Yorkshire Pension Fund, within the last few months. And investing in fossil fuels is increasingly costly. It's a financial risk, as we discussed above. UK public pensions have lost £2 billion in value because of the falling value of oil investments in the last 4 years. And this is not a trend, this is not a blip, this is a trend that is likely to continue. In fact, it's likely to accelerate. So I mentioned before Royal Dutch Shell, so they've been in the news again. They're ordered by a Dutch court recently to reduce their emissions by 45% by 2030. And this is not really conducive to a company that wants to continue making vast profits. The International Energy Agency has recently raised its forecast for the global growth of wind and solar, while stating that there is no case for further fossil fuel exploration. They've said that no new oil and natural gas fields are required beyond those that have already been approved for development. So think back to that carbon bubble. They're saying what we've got is in that little blue circle. Forget the red circle. The pension fund investments are long-term investments, which means that they're used for oil and gas exploration, not for the current output, as it were. So if the industry body states that no further exploration is required, then investment in this industry really doesn't make any sense. But I mentioned to Phil earlier, it's very, very difficult to persuade local government pension funds of this simple relationship. And after a decade of austerity and the devastating economic impact of COVID, local councils have an opportunity to use their pension funds to support local and green investment priorities. So what's happening locally? North Yorkshire Pension Fund, which covers North Yorkshire County Council and the City of York, the value as of March 2020 was 3.5 billion. Now, of course, it varies all the time, so it's different today than it was then. The fossil fuel value again at that point was about 73 million, although more recently, the chairman of the pension fund committee claimed that it was 33 million. That is likely to be an underestimate. So it's something probably between these two figures, giving it sort of a percentage of about 2%. Okay, so North Yorkshire Pension Fund is part of a bigger pool, which I'm not going to talk about at too much length. If people are interested, we could talk about Borders to Coast. This is a vehicle that includes 11 different local government pension funds and is worth £45.4 billion. Again, their total exposure to fossil fuels is around about 3%, so that's about the national average. Now, I was planning to talk about engagement with fossil fuel companies. I'm not going to do that at the moment, but please, if people want to discuss that issue, then let's come back to it in the discussion afterwards. It is important, but it's also quite involved, so we'll pass over that. This slide, though, just illustrates how poor the major fossil fuel companies are actually doing in addressing any of the things that need to be addressed if we want to be serious about reducing emissions. So all the red represents a grossly insufficient achievement on these. Full alignment, were it to be present, would be represented by green, but there's in no way are they hardly even closely aligned. This is an important article published in the Financial Times last October, illustrating the fact that big fossil fuel groups are none of them are compliant with the Paris Climate Agreement. So any sort of statement about their fantastic green achievements or aspirations is, to be honest, no more than greenwash. And in practice, low carbon projects represent less than 3% of the annual spending of fossil fuel companies around the world. So there's a huge, huge divide between what these companies are saying and what they're actually doing. So, I don't know if any of you saw this letter that we published in the Yorkshire Post recently, talking about this issue. Fossil Free North Yorkshire is, we came together last year, early part of last year. It was a kind of, it was initially a kind of a MedAct thing, but Barry and I are the two most active people involved in it, and so it's now sort of got an identity of its own. There are other people who are less involved. We are also linked to a bigger group of fossil-free campaigners who are representing all the other, well, actually 9 of the other 10 groups that are involved, that are sort of allied to the Borders to Coast grouping that I mentioned earlier. And we are also part of a fossil-free network, which is a collaboration of fossil-free campaigners from all over the country. There's a huge amount of energy and campaigning going into this work, nationally and internationally. And I guess, you know, divestment is such a fantastic prize when it is achieved, because so it's well worth getting involved in. And as I said at the beginning, anybody here who would like to get involved, please reach out and get in touch, and we'd be very delighted to have you on board. I certainly started this journey not the slightest bit interested in money or finance or pension funds, but you know, I really have come to see just how worthwhile this work can be. So thank you very much. I shall stop sharing my screen. And that's kind of the divestment. And I think Christian's now going to talk about what's in some way much more interesting and positive about what we do then with all this money that we liberate from BP and Shell and so on. So thanks, Christian. I'll pass over to you.
Thank you. I'm assuming that I'm not muted, is that correct? Yes, good. Thank you for inviting me to speak. I'm sorry if I'm a bit groggy because I'm in the middle of COVID and I haven't brought any slides, but I will try to be passionate without them. And thank you for your wonderful presentation, Margaret. Yes, so I think I should give maybe a little bit background. Barry already gave some background, but maybe I should repeat a little bit of it. I asked last July to be put onto the North Yorkshire Pension Fund Committee as a city councillor in York because of the work I'd done as chair of the Climate Change Committee and what I'd learnt in that position about the huge gulf and lack of interest and engagement that there was on the issue of pension funds at the City Council. We'd made procurement and divestment the main focus of a meeting back in March 2020, just days before the lockdown happened. Reinhardt said that pension funds are a tool in the fight against climate change, and of course he's right. At the meeting that we held back in March, we invited the head of finance and a senior councillor at Southwark Council in London to explain what they were doing to divest from fossil fuels and how they'd made the decision to switch £60 million worth of funding towards a global renewables fund. In our own city of York, senior officers at the time had only vague assurances that everything must be fine at North Yorkshire Pension Fund, and that was meant to be enough. And I found the complacency shocking. The day before I took my seat at the North Yorkshire Pension Fund, a committee meeting took place of that committee at which they agreed an ESG strategy, environment, social awareness, I think it is, and corporate governance, to steer the fund going forwards. It's fair to say, in truth, that ESG has dominated the work of the pension fund over the past 14 months. I've not attended a single meeting where we don't talk about it. And that has to be a positive step. And I have to tell you that there are quite a lot of committee members who are not very happy about having to talk about climate change issues every single time we meet. And they make the lack of interest or annoyance clear from time to time. But we're doing it, is the bottom line. And because not many of the members contribute vocally from meeting to meeting, it has been my good fortune that my voice has probably counted more than it would on a committee of 10 or 12 members, of whom I've only ever seen, I think, 3 or 4. And all the meetings have been on Zoom. So that's a bit of the context. And over that period of a year, we've been working hard to try and make sense of where we're going to go forwards. And I've been pushing really hard, specifically on the best practice I've learned as a city councillor here in York and through other things, that ultimately you can't manage what you can't measure. And that is stated most clearly, in fact, in the figures you gave a little while ago, Margaret, where you say, well, some of us think 77 million, some of us say 30 million. The truth is nobody really knows. Nobody knows. Everyone's guessing. And so I've made it the focus of my year to try and persuade the pension fund and the pension pool to agree to providing us with what's called an ESG dashboard, which would enable us on a quarterly basis to see the value of our funds and the performance of those funds in terms of carbon emissions. And fossil fuel holdings obviously fits within that. I can tell you, well, I should echo what you've said, Margaret, as well, that our pension fund represents 100,000 members. The fund is now worth 4.9 billion, not 3.5. It's been a very good year for our pension fund. That's in part because of the pandemic and the recovery from the pandemic. But as I'll explain, it's also very much tied in with the fact that our key investments are in growth-based equities. And those have got nothing to do with fossil fuels, and they're actually where all the money's coming in. So it's actually quite heartening when I sit in meetings that when I get into arguments with people who want to cling on to particular funds, that our own figures show that the funds they're clinging on to are losing us money, and the funds that have got nothing to do with fossil fuels are the ones that are making us money. So I'm happy to report, therefore, that in this month, beginning of September, sorry, Border to Coast produced the first ESG dashboard that I and others have been calling for since the beginning of the year. I can't show it to you because part of the information is confidential, not the information about the emissions of the things we hold, but I'm trying to think of the word for it, the measure of all the portfolios that we're measuring against, because there are a lot of indicators to show this is the value of our fund, this is the performance of such and such a fund, so on and so forth. And we don't yet have the permission to show the measures against which we're measuring our funds. I'm working actively to sort that out. In 10 days' time, there's the annual conference of Borders to Coast, and I will be attending that and pushing the case there. I think it's an open door. I think everyone wants to see progress here, I'm pleased to say. So we are close now to what I think we need to be able to see what we have to do. And the dashboard is great because it shows you, here are our funds, there are the 5 worst performing funds, there are the 5 best performing funds in terms of carbon emissions. Here are what you can do to switch and improve your carbon emission in your total portfolio. The very things that we've needed all along, and the things that you've mentioned earlier, Margaret, about actually being able to quantify the emissions, we're getting there. Though there's a caveat that I would say we need to bear in mind that we can't just talk about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. We also have to worry about scope 3 emissions. And I think when we talk about divestment sometimes, we don't really get into under the skin of where those carbon emissions are coming from. Again, I think there's some good news, for example, on that kind of area, is that you may all have seen a month ago the Swedish and Finnish steel industries announcing that they'd found a way of making green steel, by which they mean no longer using coke to produce the steel, but using renewable energy and hydrogen. If this can be scaled up, that's a real game changer. Steel production accounts for 8% of all the carbon emissions in the world. And if we can transform that to a zero carbon or near zero carbon industry, that will have a major impact. And it's important, therefore, in that context, that we look beyond simply who are the people producing the oil and the gas, and where are our investments and how are they contributing to all those scope 2 and scope 3 emissions down the road. And pension funds, as Reinhard said, have a huge potential to change everything. I certainly work very hard to continuously suggest to people, can we put our money over here? Can we put our money over there? Because the key is, it's easy to say what we don't want to invest in, but as I've said before, the absolute key is, what do we want to invest in? Because all pension funds are obligated to provide a return for their investors. And I'm really delighted. For example, I write to all these people. I don't care. I just write to the chief executive officers and ask questions. And I'm pleased to say they do all answer. I wrote to Baillie Gifford, who are one of the biggest portfolios we own as an investment fund that we're invested in, and said, can you tell me the carbon emissions of this portfolio, the total, what's it called, TTG, Long-Term Global Growth Fund. And they came back to me straight away and said it's zero carbon. We don't invest in fossil fuel companies. We're not interested in them. You may not like all the things we invest in. We invest in Amazon, we invest in Tesla, we invest in electronic companies. We invest in a company called Free From Meat. I think they've a huge investment in a company that's moving away from towards vegetarianism and away from meat production. But as far as they're concerned, the idea of investing in fossil fuel companies is completely at odds with their long-term plan, because they're like they're interested in where are we going to be in 20 years, in 30 years. And they represent, off the top of my head, I think it's about 16 or 18% of our total pension fund portfolio. And they're certainly the biggest performing part of the entire fund. And so the messages are there every time we sit and meet, that actually those old, what they're called are value-based equities, which we used to have significant holdings in, that we're moving away from all that stuff. We committed in July to divest ourselves of 10% of our equities portfolio and to invest instead in infrastructure. We've agreed that the 10% is actually funds that are directly engaged in, they're value-based companies. We've divested one already, and we're divesting in the next. They've committed to doing it within 5 years. I've said, can we please do it next year? The response to me is, well, we've got to find somewhere to put that 300 million or whatever it is. You know, don't murder us over this, Christian. Let us find somewhere to put the money. But the agreement has been made. It will presumably be in the minutes. Both of those value-based funds we're divesting from, we're selling off. So does that end our exposure to carbon emissions and fossil fuels? I'm not 100% sure yet, but I do know that all the fund managers get this. And whenever we discuss what we want to invest in, the fund managers are very clear. If you invest in green infrastructure, you'll make a 7% return every year. But do it sooner rather than later, because if we wait another 2 years, we'll be at the back of the queue and all the exciting projects will have been done. So the fund managers get it. The only people who don't get it, and I don't want to be rude to anyone, but the reality is that they're older people on the committee who've been serving on the pension fund for maybe 10, 15, 20, 30 years, and they're jittery about the world we're entering. And they struggle to make that change, even when the figures are put in front of them. But the good thing is that even that group of people love Baillie Gifford, because Baillie Gifford has been earning them a fortune. So when Baillie Gifford say, we're dumping all that stuff, we don't have anything to do with fossil fuels, that counts and that matters. So I'm just seeing if there's anything else I've not yet said. Oh, yes, there was something else I wanted to say as well, if I may, about small companies and big companies, because we have on the pension fund also discussed the kinds of issues that you've raised, Margaret, about Shell and BP and all those big companies. And currently, the environment and social and governance strategy does not commit to closing the door on companies who refuse to change the way they do business. And I've been pushing hard for them to change that. And there is a degree of acceptance that if you have no stick, the carrot's kind of not all that useful. On the other hand, what people say to me is, if we've got these huge companies that have to change, we do have a part to play in making that change happen. And something that's happened in the past week gives an indicator as to why there is some truth in that. And I'm not saying I'm 100% persuaded by it, but if we look at the huge increase in energy prices that we've got coming around the corner right now, half a dozen energy companies going bankrupt this week, another half a dozen feared to go bankrupt by the end of the year. We can see the dynamic of big business, small business, and the capacity of different organizations to deliver change. And if we look at what the Swedish steel company and Finnish steel companies are doing, again, we see what the scale of those corporations can do. And so I do understand why the pension fund managers are reluctant to lose the tool. They see it as a tool to persuade companies to do better. And I think that's what government is telling them. I'm certainly there saying that tool only means something if it comes with a big stick. If there's no consequence to saying, oh, we'd actually give us stuff, we're going to carry on investing in fossil fuels. This is our equity portfolio. You can buy into that. And I'm sorry you don't like 3 of the items on the list, but that's our choice. I think we need a stick to be able to move that forwards. So I think that's more or less everything. I haven't actually said the words Dodge and Cox, but that was who I was referring to. They're the company that currently invests. I think there are 3 or 4 parts of that particular fund that are invested directly in petrochemical industries, including a tar sands company. And I've certainly seen words to the effect that they have no interest in changing that. So I'm personally very pleased that we're committed to abandoning that. So yes, all I can say is keep the pressure up. I hope it's positive. I hope that I inspire you that the more we can give people positive things to invest in, the more we encourage and help pension funds to make the right decisions. Because if we just tell them what we don't like, we're left with a bunch of people who think, well, yeah, okay, I'm just feeling uncomfortable. You're telling me you don't like this, you don't like that, but where do I put my money? Because I've got 100,000 people's pensions to pay. So as long as we keep the focus on there and constructively helping people, I think we're making progress. And that's it. I hope that's of value.
Thank you very much, Christian. That certainly was, and Margaret as well. Before we go to questions and discussion, and we've got at least 15 minutes, I'm not quite sure, Phil, what time you switch us off, 7 or after 7. Christian, you talked about scope 1, 2, and 3, and maybe some people didn't pick up the link to what that means. Can you explain very quickly what that means?
Yes, yes. So it's the way we measure the emissions of an organization, a local authority, a company or a business, whatever. And scope 1 are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So it's the emissions from stuff that you have that you're doing stuff with. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions from the generation of purchased electricity or steam or heating or cooling, stuff that you bring in. And so you have a say as to whether that's from renewable sources or not. And scope 3, as I understand it, is all the other indirect emissions that occur to that local authority or company. To break it down just a little bit more, scope 3 emissions can include business travel or travel from employees, can include purchased goods and the carbon, embedded carbon in those goods, waste operations, what you do with your waste, fuel and energy related activities, capital goods, I suppose you'd put the pension fund under scope 3. Investments, definitely. End of life treatment when you dispose of goods. So broadly speaking, it's that 3 different classes of goods. And the point is that the fossil fuels fall within one little part of that, or fall within 2 different parts of that, in that we can burn them directly yourself, or when you bring stuff in, you're making use of products and services that will have used fossil fuels.
Okay, Christian, thanks. That's very helpful. Now, has anyone got any questions or comments they wish to make? And if you have, can you raise your hand and I'll call the name, whoever it is, and then you can unmute yourself and hold forth. So anyone like to ask a question or make a comment on what they've heard already? Margaret, you need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just thought it was, I picked up on something that you said, Christian, about, you know, alluding to that kind of sense that Shell and BP and these other major oil and gas and oil majors, as they're called, you know, they still have this kind of reputation of being solid, reliable, dependable sort of operations, and this is one of the reasons I think that it's so difficult to persuade, you know, as you say, some older, more traditional councillors to take that step and say we're going to move away from this. That was just the point I wanted to make.
At the very least, what I think we should be doing, because I'm aware, I think I read in the news today that is it a company called, it's one of the offshoots of BP that is solely invested in solar power, that has, they've just declared a massive scheme to produce power for, I think they said today in the paper, 6 million homes. I think what we need to be doing at the very least is refusing to invest in anything that they do other than stuff that they're doing that is fossil fuel free. Then I think we have a part to play in persuading them to do the right thing. But if we just invest in BP shares and Shell shares, I mean, we don't. I've not seen any indication that the pension fund invests in that in any way. But I think that we have to be absolutely clear if we're going to deal with those kind of companies about what our money goes towards.
Okay, any other questions or points people want to make? Because can I say very...
Right, Barry Reinhardt's got his hand up.
Oh, sorry, Reinhardt, didn't see you. Can you unmute yourself, Reinhardt, and let's have your question or contribution.
Yeah, if you want to go ahead, Barry, please go ahead. Otherwise, I make my...
Oh, carry on.
I have one comment and one question. The comment is, I hear again and again the death or end of our planet. I feel this is, in my opinion, a euphemism. It will be the death of human civilization and maybe the end of human beings. I'm sure some viruses and bacteria will survive and create a new type of life on Earth. So I don't think we need to concern, and I think we need to be more direct and clear about this, not to be too concerned about the end of the planet. That's my view on the issue we are facing. My question is related to this reluctance to reinvest, and I would like us to better understand what are the reasons behind it. I mean, Christian already mentioned the age of some older council members. Maybe it's this one, but I have other things in mind, like in the past, fossil fuel companies offered a very high return on investment. So is it that some people believe that it will happen again, or they will be going back to this one? Or is it that, I mean, there is all this talk about technological solutions. So some believe carbon capture and others will solve all our problems, and we don't really need to do anything else but encourage sort of science and technology development. Another aspect is that, is it confusing? Because today I read an article about the digital industry and how much pollution it creates, because it always appears as very green, but a lot of their energy is generated through coal burning, but that doesn't appear anywhere. So is it uncertainty really what to do and where to invest? Because so many different messages come across that maybe the others are not that much better. I mean, Shell and BP, the fossils, are obviously clearly polluting, but others, it may be a bit more hidden, but they may be similar or maybe even worse. So there are lots of reasons, and I think in order to address this problem and reluctance, I think it's good to better understand the reason. I know Christian has already explained some, but I always find it not quite so clear what stops people from investing or reinvesting in other business. Or is it a lack of sort of return on investment in other areas that they think, oh, we can't just go and change the investment and then sort of basically endanger our pension fund?
Shall
Thanks
I?
for that, Reinhard. Christian, would you like to answer that? Because you're the closest that we have to the people who make those decisions, often on the recommendation of officers.
Yes.
So fire away, please.
Well, I suppose you can say that I'm one of those who are making the decisions as well.
Yes.
So I have to accept responsibility for that. I think it's a good question that you ask, Reinhard. What I see, and I'm a believer that you actually get the best idea of what's going on in an organization in the first few months that you're there, and that eventually, whatever organization we're in, we have a great tendency to become institutionalized and to accept whatever is considered to be the truth in that organization. What I'm seeing is, from the very word go, every meeting I attended when we looked at the performance of the portfolios and all of that, is the belief, which must come from decades of experience, that a pension fund works best by hedging different bits of funding, different sources of funding against each other, so that you're protected from crises and blips that happen in the global economic system. So the pension fund invests in growth-based equities, it invests in value-based equities, it invests in gilts, in money, it now is going to invest in property. It has holdings in a number of different areas, and it's seen as the sensible thing to do, to have those pots of money in different things so that when one thing goes down, you're protected by another thing. And in terms of equities, what I've seen very clearly is that the dynamic between growth-based equities and value-based equities is at the core of the discomfort of certain pension members to move on and move away from value-based equities. I've tried to suggest to fund managers, there must surely be value-based equities that are not invested in fossil fuels. Why don't we just shift the money to that? It'd still be a value. I should explain maybe for everyone what a value-based equity is, I suppose. Yes. Growth-based equities are those companies that fund managers and investors believe are a sure bet for making money. So they will invest £1,000, £1 million, £100 million in an organization, in a company that seems certain to do well. So, you know, whether we like it or not, if you've got 100 million to spend and you invest it in Amazon, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a return at this moment in time. Whether that's true in 5 years' time, nobody knows. But those companies, Tesla, all the electronics companies, the social media companies, are seen as pretty good bets. Green infrastructure is increasingly being seen in the same way. Value-based equities, on the other hand, are the opposite of the pendulum. Basically, they're run by managers who look at everything that's performing badly, and they make decisions about whether they think the market's got it wrong. So they'll look at a company that sells Nintendo Wii and think to itself, well, you know, that was fashionable 10 years ago, but no one's buying them anymore. The growth-based companies won't touch it with a barge pole. The value-based companies may say, well, you know, it might pick up again. I think we should buy them while the price is low, and then maybe we'll make our money when it picks up. And that's exactly why they're invested in companies like fossil fuel companies. They can see that fossil fuel companies are on the ropes. You don't need to tell them that. They know it. That's why they invest in them. They invest in them because they're doing badly, because they have the belief that maybe it'll turn around. And maybe we'll all discover that actually climate change wasn't real, or that maybe we'll all discover that actually fossil fuels are a great thing, or that we'll need them anyway. And regardless of what we say, we're just going to carry on burning them and we'll all go to hell and we might as well make money. But whatever reasoning, fossil fuels are all in that value-based category in terms of equities. And the reason that we invest in those two sides, the funds is invested in those two sides, is about this pendulum, about investing in things that are going up and investing in the things that are at the bottom. And we're having to relearn whether that's a wise thing to do. And we're having to relearn how it is that we view investments in terms of fiduciary responsibilities that include the responsibility to our own future and the planet's future. And I take on board your comment, Reinhard. No, the planet isn't going to disappear, but we run grave risks of wiping ourselves off it. So when I say the planet, I do take your point.
Thank you, Christian. I hope that answers many, if not all, of Reinhardt's questions and points that he raised. Just to say a couple of things. First of all, Fossil Free North Yorkshire has engaged, we've spoken with the Pension Funds Committee through, I think it was with one of our supporters some time ago via the internet at a meeting where many of these points that Margaret and Christian have put were put to them. So we have engaged with them in a discussion. And we also collected a petition with, I think, quite a few hundred signatures about the whole question of divestment, which we have sent to them. So in North Yorkshire Fossil Fuels North, we have been active in lobbying as best we can the County Council Pension Fund Committee, but there's much more to do. Now, is there any other questions or comments people would like to make? Because it's 7 o'clock, but
I did
question from Jonathan.
It looks like we can stay on for a few more minutes.
I did see Jonathan's hand go
Just
up.
a very
Yeah.
quick question is, does the North Yorkshire Pension Board have any pressure from people paying into the pension or people receiving pensions as to how the money they've put into the pension fund is invested? Do you get any pressure from them or interest?
No, I can't say that we do. We have had a couple of people speak. Margaret came and spoke last year at some point, as I recall. I think it's a very useful thing to do. And I would love to attend a meeting where before we started, they'd have to tell us that, well, in the past quarter, we've had 100 letters from our members asking us to do this or to do that. I think that would be a good thing, because I have to say, it is very much a cocoon. You are in a bubble when you do these things. And again, I said, you know, that very few of the pension fund members say much from one meeting to the next. It would, I think, be a good thing if they were hearing regularly from people who have pensions with them, asking them to do better, asking them to do the right thing.
Can they be encouraged? Can the members be encouraged to give feedback or to feed in? I mean,
I think this, with there's in fossil-free North Yorkshire, there's nobody who is a North Yorkshire Pension Fund pensioner, or either paying in or a pensioner, which is a sort of an issue, and it would be really good to have representatives who are actually pensioners, or, as I say, workers paying into the pension fund. And if we had more capacity, it's one thing that we would really want to do, which would be to engage with, you know, the people, the many thousands of people in North Yorkshire who are either paying into the pension fund or pensioners. So yeah, I think that's a very good point that you're making, Jonathan.
Just further to that, Jonathan, the local government staff unions are represented. They send an observer to the Pension Funds Committee in North Yorkshire, and we as Fossil Food North Yorkshire have written to Unison, which is mainly the white and blue collar union there. We haven't written to the Unite Union or the GMB, but we've asked Unison to pursue their policies against the climate emergency for divestment with them, with the county council. And basically they've been overwhelmed with job cuts. They've now got reorganisation with unitary authorities coming in, and they haven't really been as proactive as we would like them to be. We're also talking to the regional TUC in Leeds to try and get the other unions that I mentioned to have a more concerted approach with their respective pension funds, because the staff, the workers in these industries do have representation through their trade unions on the pension fund committees. And that applies also to the National Union of Students, who can also put pressure along with the lecturers unions and teachers unions in their respective funds to get change as well. So never ignore that avenue either.
Thank you.
Can I quickly respond?
Yes.
To that? I need to maybe make a distinction for you between the North Yorkshire Pension Fund Board and the North Yorkshire Pension Fund Committee. The board is the one that I think receives representations from trades unions and other groups. The pension fund does not have anyone representing trades unions or anything. It's simply a group of councillors. And one of the members is of the pension fund committee is the chair of the pension fund board. So he will then come to the committee and say what has been discussed at the board, but that's as close as we get to what other people might be saying. But there is a list of all the people, all the organisations who have their pensions with the North Yorkshire Pension Fund. And I'm sure that's public information. And it includes companies and schools and local authorities and whatever. So I can't see that there's any reason why one might not approach those organisations and suggest that they might like to get actively involved.
Yeah.
And just also to further clarify, the Pension Fund Committee is the body that makes the decisions. The Pension Fund Board doesn't actually have any power to change the direction that the Pension Fund Committee is going in.
Yeah, that's true. The Pension Fund Committee is the committee that makes strategic decisions. The Pension Fund Board is basically involved with the managing of day-to-day managing of how many letters have been replied to and that procedural side of the fund.
Okay, that's very helpful. And also probably confuses people even more with the levels of bureaucracy that exist. Anybody else want to raise their hand? We've lost one person just after 7. Lucy, do you want to say anything? No? Yes, hello, Lucy. And Reinhardt. Lucy first. Do you want to say anything, Lucy?
I was just wondering, with it being fossil fuels, obviously you've mentioned about BP and Shell and their obvious like fuel like the obvious fossil fuels that are burnt, but does it also include like plastic production? Because obviously they use fossil fuels as well. Is that kind of encapsulated as well in the fossil-free North Yorkshire?
That's a very good question to which I don't know the answer. I don't know whether either Margaret or Christian have any comment to make on that, or even an answer.
Well, the fossil, so the fossil-free network, if you like, UK Divest, I showed you that report that UK Divest had produced earlier this year, and what they use is the 200 companies in the world that are most responsible for making gas, oil and coal. Now, plastics are an integral part of that industry. But for example, a company that whose essential thing is making plastics may not be one of those 200 companies, or they may be, but if they're not, then the 201st company most responsible for oil, coal and gas is not included in the list of, if you like, target companies. Does that sort of answer your question, Lucy?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
You can see just how complicated this whole thing gets.
Yeah.
And mired in complexity. And I think what Christian was alluding to is really important, and also to some extent partly addresses what Reinhardt was saying. Is it is digging down into the detail. It is asking those questions. It is having that sort of curiosity to say, well, what's actually going on here? So it's really good to ask those sorts of questions.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just say something as well, Lucy. You've got to exactly where the complexity lies. Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are quite easy. How much energy have we brought? How much heating are we putting in this building? The real challenge, and what local authorities are finding difficult and what businesses are finding difficult, are Scope 3 emissions. When you buy a computer, the box that computer comes in, the screen has got plastics in it, wherever those plastics come from. How do I account for it? How do I offset that? Can I offset it? And that's where, in terms of the discussions that go on in the pension fund, I can tell you that the pension fund managers and the pension pool that we were invested with, that represents, as Mary said, it's about £50 billion worth of investments. They're quite comfortable with finding out where the investment is in a coal company or an oil company. That's not that tricky. But when we say to them, we want to properly understand the carbon cost of the whole of this portfolio of investment, all the different companies we're buying into, it is very, very complicated. And in truth, everyone's working, I think purposefully. I think many people are working with goodwill to try and get to grips with that, because our future depends on finding mechanisms to properly quantify all those hidden emissions.
Okay. Any other questions people want to raise? If not, would our two speakers, for which many thanks for coming, just like to sum up in 2 or 3 sentences?
Barry,
sorry, Reinhardt, sorry.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Christian for his explanation. This was very helpful about his growth and value-based investments. And I have 2 questions linked to it. I don't want. One is there any historical evidence that companies who were going down go up again? So is there a good reason to believe, I mean, from historical experience, that this is happens quite often, sometimes regularly? And the second one is, how do new areas of investment are sort of categorized in these 2 groups? Like in terms of green technology, or what my specific interest is, for instance, social housing. which I think would make an interesting area of investment, especially if you want to create high quality social housing, passive house standard, and so on, which I think we need, but nobody would be able to afford it in the short term. But in my opinion, pension funds would be ideal to have a long-term perspective and say we own so much social housing and it generates value over many generations. So I don't know whether I made myself clear. Thank you.
Well, that's great. They're good questions. And we have to assume that value-based equities have given over the years, otherwise they wouldn't exist. But I can tell you that Dodge & Cox, the company, the portfolio that I mentioned a couple of times, it's been losing for the past 6 years. So if they got rid of fossil fuels and they shifted to, I don't know what, the makers of a game that was no longer very popular, or a company that made shoes that was no longer as exciting as they used to be, on the basis they may design some wonderful shoes in the future, then they may come, that may be a good investment. So I don't think it would be fair to say that it has never worked, because I can't believe that they would have invested in, funds would have invested in that if it had never worked. On the other question, social housing, that's very interesting, because I've been putting forwards in the past 2 weeks, and I've mentioned this to the fund manager, the treasurer, and to the city council here, that we're currently going through in North Yorkshire and York devolution proposals that are about how we're going to be the first carbon negative region in the country, which is what people have declared they want to be. In my personal view, I'd have to say as a realist that what they're wanting, or what they're saying they aspire to, is pure fantasy, because I see very little indication that people are prepared to put the investment that's required. So we're committed to creating a zero carbon York as a city council. I see no way that a council can deliver a zero carbon York, because it's not in the council's gift. A council can deliver a zero carbon council. It can look at all its operations and do that, but it cannot change the behavior of everyone else. But more importantly is the macroeconomics, and this is where pension funds come in. If York declares, York is going to declare a zero carbon strategy by the end of this year, and that will include a zero carbon pathway, which will commit the city to reducing carbon emissions year on year going forwards. And I've pushed very hard as the chair of the Climate Change Committee for that to happen, because I think when that's agreed, we're going to have to look the beast in the eye, because we're playing fantasy climate change on local authorities. We believe that getting 200 more people to cycle a day to work is going to nail climate change. It's not. But to look at it more positively, we have 7,500 council homes in York. If as part of Zero Carbon York, we commit to making those zero carbon homes, this is where Phil knows more about this than I do. But if I work on the basis that it costs £30,000 to transform a house into a passive house, just as a rule of thumb, that then suggests £225 million to create passive house standard council homes across our city. That's a significant sum of money. If we replicate that across the whole of our city with its 80,000 homes, that's an even more significant sum of money. If we look at it across the entire region, it's a very, very considerable sum of money. How are we ever going to do that? Well, one of the ways we could think to do that, in my view, is to create a plan that looks at the standard archetypes for housing and says, we've got 500 of this type of standard semi-detached in one part of York. We've got the same kind of houses in Scarborough. We've got the same in Harrogate, in Ripon, so on and so forth. Let's put together a plan to retrofit 5,000 homes to passive house standard and have it as our goal that in the doing of that, we will get so efficient at doing it that we can cut the cost by half. And then we can roll that out across our whole county. How on earth are we going to pay for that? Well, my view is if we do the 5,000 homes, we demonstrate it's possible. And if we offer to institutional investors, such as pension funds, a scheme that says the money that is saved from the reduced energy bills in that home, the difference between the retrofitted home and the home before it was retrofitted, is a pool of money that the owner of that home will carry on paying, and that money will repay the debt of retrofitting that home. So that, say your energy bill is £1,000 a year, you retrofit the home and it becomes £150 a year. The owner of the house carries on paying £1,000 a year, and the £850 goes to the institutional investor to pay the debt off for a period of 10, 15, 20 years. In my view, if we could structure that kind of a macroeconomic plan that made sense, I think that we could persuade institutional investors and pension funds to invest in the retrofitting of our housing stock. It won't happen with kind of happy dreams. It has to come with really hard thought and implemented economics. And I think if we can do that, then institutional investors have a part to play in transforming the infrastructure. And certainly our pension fund has committed to investing 10% of the fund in infrastructure now. And City of York Council has said, we want at least a third of that to be invested in green infrastructure as soon as possible. So in answer to your question, Reinhardt, yes, 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 yes. I think that pension funds and institutional investors have a key part to play in transforming the housing stock and other parts of the infrastructure of this country, this region and this country. But it relies on us getting the facts together, because I can tell you right now, the pension funds don't really understand. They've got nothing in front of them that makes sense. And the pension pool doesn't really have things that make sense. So we've got a lot of work to do, but it's worth doing. Sorry, that was a bit long.
And you also raised a number of points which could be the subject of another meeting.
Sorry, yes. And I'm aware that I'm vulnerable to Phil knowing much more about housing than I do.
But it's nevertheless an important discussion to be had, I think, in the very near future. Margaret, do you want to say anything, or anyone else, before we wind up?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that sounds absolutely fantastic idea, Christian, and maybe we should have a further discussion about this and really try and focus in on supporting such a move. And otherwise, I think this has been actually a really positive session. I think only Lucy is left. Thank you for staying the course, Lucy. It's been great to have your contribution to this evening.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Good, good. And Reinhardt, of course. Sorry, Reinhardt. I was yeah. And again, thank you for Christian for your fantastic contributions, and Barry for chairing, and Phil for supporting.
That's fine. I shall stop recording now. Thank you, everybody.